Hi everyone and welcome to the Curious Geographer. Today I'm super excited that we are going to be speaking to Dr Amber Martin-Woodhead from Coventry University. So this live interview is in collaboration with Time for Geography and in partnership with Coventry University. And we're going to be talking about fast fashion, the issues with fast fashion, and as I said, Dr Amber Martin-Woodhead is our guest. So Amber is just on screen now. So Amber, if you wouldn't mind just giving a little wave to everybody here. And so Amber is a human geographer with an interest in the geographies of consumption, sustainability, and feminist geography. And we're going to be talking about the clothing sector or textile sector, as it is a truly global industry where textiles are grown, manufactured, transported and sold globally. However, there is an issue with maybe how our clothes are produced, but also the waste that is also produced from clothing. So today we're going to discuss the human and environmental costs of fast fashion, from production to disposal, and then explore how consumers, so how you potentially watching, and retailers can move towards sustainable and ethical fashion solutions. So I'm going to pass over to Amber. So Amber, if you wouldn't mind starting by telling us, what exactly is fast fashion?
Oh, of course. Well, it's a term I'm sure everyone's quite familiar with, but sometimes we don't always think about why we use the term. So traditionally, you think about fast food, producing quite cheap food quickly, and we apply that to fashion. So it's about producing fashion or garments in very high volumes, but at a very low price point. And there's a lot of issues then associated with that, because essentially fast fashion can sometimes then equate almost with throwaway fashion, because we're so used to fast trends appearing. So it used to be that there were seasonal fashion trends. So you'd have the spring summer collections, the autumn winter collections. So you might have 2 to 4 fashion seasons a year. But now that is completely out the window, and you have almost 50 to 100 almost micro seasons of fashion every year. So there's weekly fashion trends, there's daily fashion trends, especially with the rise of social media as well. So that's kind of what fast fashion is in a nutshell. It also again links to this idea of being throwaway, because the styles change so quickly. It makes you feel almost pressured to get what's in store online there and then, buy now or never, because you're never going to see that item again in the store. And the other element is it's not designed to last a long time. So there's not a kind of built-in longevity to fast fashion. There's this thing called planned obsolescence, and we hear that term a lot when we talk about, say, technology. Things are literally not built to last. Well, the same thing happens with low-cost, high volume fashion. There's a planned obsolescence to it. Things that produce garments that are not designed to be worn for 20 years. And they're designed to last, say, 10 washes or so. So it encourages people to buy in volume, buy cheap, buy lots, and buy quickly. And then unfortunately, maybe get rid of it quickly as well.
I completely, it's so different even from when I grew up as well. I don't even feel I'm that old, but you used to go down and say in Topshop, there would be the summer wardrobe. And if you didn't get it, then you couldn't buy the clothes because one of your other friends would have it. And there was only a small amount of options that you could have. Whereas now, as you said, if you go into a shop the week after, it's it's gone. There's something completely different on the shelves. Would you mind telling us how it links to kind of globalization as well?
Oh, of course, yeah. So fashion hugely relates to globalization, and it's all to do with how we've had this global shift in the global economy. So production has essentially of garments has completely been outsourced to the global south. So sometimes things are, say, manufactured in England, but the majority of garments that we wear in the UK are imported. And the reason for this is all to do with money. It is much, much cheaper to pay someone in, say, Bangladesh, next to nothing to produce something, even with the combined cost of all the communication and shipping, or air travel of something back. It's still so much cheaper to outsource production. So what that means is your wardrobe that you've got at home, not just yours, Ellie, but one's wardrobe is a kind of global commodity. If you looked in all your made-in labels, it's probably more well-travelled than all of us, because everything comes from everywhere. So there's this huge global network, and then it gets further and more complicated, because if you think of something you might think is quite simple, like a t-shirt, well, the cotton might come from Uzbekistan. The thread might have been woven in India. It might have finally been put together in Vietnam. It might be branded in the USA, and it might be sold across the world. So fashion is this hugely global commodity.
And we were just talking earlier about the kind of made-in labels, and they don't tell us much at all about the kind of life journey of a product. What exactly does it mean when it says made in Vietnam?
It can be quite complicated and a little bit muddy as to what a made-in label actually means. So you might have purchased, say, a lovely pair of designer sunglasses that say made in Italy, which is lovely. And I presume if I said that to you, you'd go, oh, well, that means they were made in Italy. But well, not necessarily. Made in labels only have to show the last point of production and packaging. So it could say made in Italy, but actually the majority of the product was assembled elsewhere across the globe, and then maybe like the final bits or the little logos were popped in an Italian factory, and then it was all packaged up there. So there's that element to it as well. And also they're just incredibly opaque, because if something says made in China, well it's not exactly whittled that down much, has it? It's not saying what region, what factory, what person produced it. It's just entirely generic and vague.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about maybe some of the issues with that when we talk about solutions as well. But yeah, it's quite hard maybe if you really want to find out where something comes from. Doesn't really help by looking at the label so much, as you were saying.
No, it doesn't. And it's very difficult for individual shoppers to find stuff out.
So let's go on to kind of the crux of what we're going to talk about today, the kind of human costs and environmental issues. So what are the human costs of fast fashion?
An awful lot, unfortunately. The garment industry is, of course, a global one, employing millions and millions of people in very difficult working environments. So we often hear the term sweatshop banded around. And of course, in the 90s, books like No Logo and Naomi Klein, our attention was suddenly shifted to this idea of thinking about where things were produced. But difficult working conditions don't just have to be in an informal sweatshop. There are lots of regulated, hundreds of millions, not millions, thousands and thousands of regulated formal garment factories. But just because something is a formal garment factory doesn't necessarily mean there are good working conditions at all. Regulation can be very difficult. There are countless stories of inspectors, going in to make sure everything's all right. And of course, the workers are all told to tell a certain story, which is, of course, nothing like the realities of what's going on. If you're interested in this, I'd really recommend a book by Safia Minney, who's the founder of People Tree, a fair trade and sustainable fashion company. And she wrote this amazing book called Slave to Fashion. And in it, she talks about lots of first-hand accounts of people working in the fashion industry, in which she recounts hideously long hours of people working, and gives examples of, say, in India, going into factories and seeing people working 60 to 77 hours a week. So can you imagine going to work at the beginning, 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, and someone saying to you, well, you'll leave here at 8 o'clock at night, and then doing that every day of the week, never having a day off. And often in very difficult working hours. If you've ever travelled to various countries in the global south, such as India, Bangladesh, very, very hot countries as well. So, difficult working environments, lack of breaks, and lots of issues with sexual harassment, intimidation, bullying. And then it gets a lot more serious, because the fashion industry is renowned for having huge issues with something called bonded labour. And bonded labour is kind of a form of slavery. There's been some interesting academic studies done about this in Italy, for example, where people from China, it's these sort of positions advertising garment factories saying how great they are, and then Chinese people are essentially sort of trafficked sort of slightly. It's all a bit complicated, and then they end up in these garment factories, and they are essentially stuck there because they're told, oh, well, we've paid lots of money to get you here, now you're going to have to work to repay that loan. So it's essentially slavery. There's that, and of course always the most tragic of child labour, which continues across the globe. Safia Minneh talks about that in her books, and that can often happen with things like sort of sequins or beadwork, things that require a lot of human output. So there are some serious issues in the fashion industry that are very harrowing.
I think just kind of going back to what you were saying at the beginning, because I know you, Amber, and I have had a conversation about this, and that term sweatshops as well, that is often used in kind of school geography lessons. And actually you were saying how it's probably best to use that term either a formal garment industry, is that like a formal, and then an informal one. And then, as you were saying, there can still be really difficult conditions even in like formal garment kind of factories.
Yes. And there can even be, it doesn't even have to be in an informal factory. So a lot of the time what happens is a regulated garment factory will get an order from a big retailer, and the retailer will want X amount of pairs of jeans in a certain amount of time, and the factory will go, oh yes, of course we can do that for you, no problem, we'll have that to you. Because they don't want to lose the contract, because that retailer can go to any other factory around the globe. So that factories, or formal ones, end up taking on more work than they can actually do. And then, of course, that's when informal outsourcing happens. So orders will then get outsourced to maybe factories that aren't as well regulated, or even people will make garments in their own homes, sat on the streets as well. So that's why it's really difficult to trace where things come from, because even if you've got something that, there's lots of websites now and they say, oh, we're using this factory and it's all really well accounted for, it doesn't always account for these informal subcontracting issues that go on.
Yeah, so yeah, if they can't, as you say, if they can't say yes to the clothing that they've taken from it or had an agreement they would make, that's when they then outsource it even further to a different one.
Yes.
So you really might have no idea where it's come from. And then there was the big Rana Plaza that collapsed. I think it was in 2014 or 2012, that killed like 1,400 garment workers as well.
Yes.
Has the fashion industry or kind of factories shifted from that big disaster in the fashion industry, or are still similar practices going on?
I think what it did was it highlighted what the issues were it brought it into people's conscious about how difficult the global garment industry is. It was sort of a catalyst for raising awareness, which is not a nice way of having to have a disaster to essentially raise awareness of these issues. I think a lot of retailers have had a lot more pressures on them to be far more transparent about where things come from because of that vastly increased consumer awareness of the very precarious conditions in which garment workers have to work in every day.
Just to say to everybody watching, say hi in the chat. If you have any questions, just write them and I will pass them on to Amber. So don't worry if you just started watching it and just thought of one, just put them in chat and I'll pass them on to Amber. So let's go on to the environmental issues. And earlier you said to me that it's hard to fit on a visual to share with everyone. So over to you, Amber, to tell us about the environmental issues associated with fast fashion.
Yes, now this is tricky because there are so many environmental issues associated with fast fashion, but what I'm going to try and do is just summarize some of the key ones in a nutshell. And maybe if we could think about something quite simple. So say you have a pair of jeans, and that pair of jeans is most likely going to be made of about 96% cotton and maybe 4%, maybe some form of elastane or polyester. So if we could think about that and where that pair of jeans has come from, well, the first step is, of course, cotton. And we often romanticize cotton. It's a beautiful plant. And I think we often think if something's made from cotton, it's very sustainable, it's a natural product. And of course, it is natural, but what people don't often realize about cotton is it's an incredibly thirsty plant. It requires, or non-organic cotton requires a huge amount of irrigation. So often people might have heard of in school of the classic example is the dwindling nature of the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan, which has shrunk massively over the years because of irrigating cotton crops to the south of it. So you've got the huge amounts of water that go into production of textiles. And then, of course, just like in the food industry, we think about not wanting to always, eat food covered in pesticides or insecticides. Well, often the majority of the clothes that we wear, if it's cotton, is often been coated in large amounts of insecticides and pesticides as well, unless it's organic cotton, which I might talk about later. So you can think about the fabric itself, and of course there's tens of hundreds of different fabrics which all have different issues and positive things as well, so I can't talk about them all today. But if we move on to thinking about when that pair of jeans is produced, think about the factory that's producing it, the huge amounts of energy just to run a factory in itself. Often that pair of jeans will be dyed a certain colour. Cotton isn't naturally a blue denim colour. There will be colour added. Sometimes, and lots of the time, dyes can be used that are highly toxic. I think it's something like 20% of water toxicity pollution comes from the garment industry. So there's huge issues of waste water coming out of factories that have used all these chemical dyes and processes. And then, of course, just the waste materials that when you produce something, especially quickly and cheaply, you get, you cut out a garment and it's going to have waste offcuts of fabric. So things are, of course, going to be wasted along the way. And then say you've made your pair of jeans and it's all finished and they all look lovely. Well, we often talk again about food miles. That's quite a common term. We think about where our foods come from, but also we can think about fashion miles. As I said earlier, fashion is the garment industry is globalized, and your pair of jeans is likely to have traveled all the way around the globe and back again, because of course there wasn't just the cotton that produced it, there was the zipper that was maybe came from somewhere else, there were all the different rivets and intricacies of that garment, and they've all had to travel from somewhere, and then they will be transported the majority of the time to periphery from the sort of global south to the global north. So you have that carbon footprint of how the garments get there. And then this is one often people forget, because I often ask students to do this sort of thing, like think of what the environmental costs. I say, well, what about in store? And people kind of get to that point and go, oh, well, I'm not sure. Well, of course, if you walk into a big retail store, or even an online store, it's going to have a big factory. It's going to need energy, electricity. It's going to need to be heated. So if you think about stores, they're bright, they're light, they're warm. So you've got the energy cost of that. You've got the packaging then surrounding your garment. It'll all been wrapped up probably in plastic, probably on a plastic hanger, which is sort of the cursed product of the fashion industry, often horribly difficult to recycle. And then consumers end up with loads of them that they don't want them, and then they get chucked away. So there's that element as well. That's before we've even got this poor pair of jeans home, which unfortunately is where the highest environmental impact of that pair of jeans will happen. So the highest sort of issues environmentally come from the washing of your clothes, the energy it takes to wash your clothes in a washing machine. To heat up the water and the wastewater as well. So it's a bit, it's people are often quite shocked by that because it's that continual washing and use. And then unfortunately, if your pair of jeans has got a bit of polyester in, which is essentially fabric, plastic, microfibers and plastics will end up in the water, which will then penetrate the water system, and we're having huge issues now of finding aquatic life with microplastics in them. So that's another issue. And then finally, you've worn your pair of jeans, it's been washed however many times, and then it's where it ends up. So often vast amounts of our clothes end up in landfill. It's about every second globally a dumper truck of garments gets disposed in landfill. It's about an Empire State Building every day. Just gets into the ground. If it's a cotton, it still sits there. There's methane emissions. If it's plastic, if it's made of polyester, it'll sit there for 200 to 400 years, or just won't biodegrade at all. So yes, unfortunately, there's quite a lot of environmental issues associated with that garment.
Wow, I probably would have thought of the impact within the shop and the packaging, and also even when people are, if you buy online and then sell it back again, there's a lot of packaging and energy that goes into that. But not often, I don't know, when we already thought of the consumer use as well, that kind of energy of washing and drying, particularly in countries that have a high water use through washing machines. That's probably really, really high, and something, to reflect on. But is that a fast fashion issue, or is that just a clothing issue?
Yeah, it's probably not fair to blame that all on fast fashion, because whatever clothes you had, whether they're high-end, GOTS certified cotton, fair trade clothes, they're still going to need washing at some point, and the energy it takes. But there are things consumers can do to reduce that impact of their washing, which I will come to.
Well, I think this might be a great moment to kind of go on to maybe what are the solutions, and one solution that we've kind of talked about is sustainable and ethical fashion. There's already been a question that's come up. I'll ask you that maybe once you've spoken about it. So what is sustainable and ethical fashion?
Well, sustainable fashion often relates to the environment, and ethical fashion relates to humans. That's the simple, but often the terms just get thrown around interchangeably. But that's what we mean by that. We've been looking at the human costs and the environmental costs. So if we're thinking about alternatives and what we can do, again, I don't have time to go into everything today, but some key things you might want to think about are alternative fabrics, for example. So I spoke about how everyone thinks cotton's lovely and natural, but actually there's a lot of environmental issues associated with it. The other thing with organic cotton is it's quite difficult to regulate, and it needs to be GOTS certified organic cotton, that sort of special specification to ensure it's truly organic. But that's of course a wonderful option in terms of allowing people to produce cotton but not using the insecticides, the pesticides, and having that huge amount of water use. But we're seeing really innovative fabrics being created. Some from natural wood pulp, for example, things like viscose, tencel is a brand name for it's kind of lyocell. So wood pulp is essentially almost like you make paper. It's made into a fabric. So of course there's issues of deforestation, but if it's managed well and repopulated with forest, that's a really good alternative, because of course it's easy to, if it does end up in landfill, it's easier to decompose, it's plant-based. We're seeing a lot more fabrics being made of things from post-consumer waste, which isn't necessarily perfect, because if you've got, say, a t-shirt made from recycled plastic bottles, that's quite a common thing now. It's still the issue of where does it go in landfill, but it's sort of getting towards more circular economies where we're using up things that are already in existence, rather than creating kind of virgin fabrics, fabrics that have just kind of come from had to be generated especially, but using things that we already have. So that's one option, particularly on the environmental side. Ethically wise, trying to look for fair trade fashion is a good way to go, because I'm sure everyone's heard about fair trade at school and fair trade chocolate and tea, and I know I learned all about that stuff when I was at school. But fair trade fashion isn't something that's hugely on the agenda, and I think it really should be, because it ensures that people who made our clothes get a fair wage. So that's another option as well.
Do you mind just telling that we've got a question, and then
Sure.
I'll go into this actually. So one question said, what does the label ethically sourced mean? So I know you've just talked about fair trade, but what does ethically sourced mean? Does it have any legal significance in the fashion industry, or is it more of a buzzword to greenwash consumers?
What a wonderful question. And the honest answer is, I don't know. And that's because I imagine ethically sourced isn't a sort of significant trademark that is used. So I'd be wary of anything that, unless it said it was a fair trade product, I would be a bit concerned, or I wouldn't be sure. You might have to do some research. But yes, just ethically sourced seems a bit general. People use that term all the time, don't they, on Glamour, sort of sustainably sourced, and it's such a good question, because what does that mean? And you often see products that say have a nice big green label on them, and they say sustainable, or this is our sustainable collection, and you look at it and it'll say something like, this was made from 30% post-consumer waste. I'm like, well, where does the other 70% come from? And it's still made of waste product, it's still gonna be difficult to dispose of. So yeah, there are huge problems of greenwashing within the fashion industry, and it is very dangerous, because essentially it turns ethical, sustainable fashion into a branding strategy, which isn't always genuine.
And do you mind, just for maybe our younger audience, saying what do you mean by the circular economy?
The circular economy, well, it's best if I start with describing what the linear economy is. So the linear economy is the idea that you take your natural resource, or whatever, say, and you create a product, and then you use the product, and then it goes in the bin. A circular economy is different, because you use a resource, and then you manufacture it, and then you use it, and then when it's reached the end of its life, instead of it dying, going into the bin, it's reappropriated back into a new economy. So an example might be the plastic bottle that's created. Instead of going to the bin, it gets reappropriated and then used to create a t-shirt or something like that. And then when that t-shirt comes to the end of its life, it might get reappropriated and made into the filling for a dog bed or something really random like that. But that's often where recycled fabrics end up, or in the mulch in horses where they exercise and things like that. So it's all to do with being circular, is basically stopping things going from landfill and making them be, making sure they're reused in a new economic cycle.
And I believe you have some tips of maybe practical things that students or geographers or just our audience, which maybe they can kind of include in their own practice in terms of how they approach fashion and fast fashion.
Definitely, because I think everyday people, we all can make a difference, and it's actually quite a powerful thing that we can all do. And I know I've painted quite a sad picture of the global fashion industry, but I don't want to depress everyone, because there are lots of things that you can do. And the best thing that you can do as an individual, if you want to contribute to sort of being a bit more green with your fashion, is, ironically, it's kind of not doing anything. Is the best thing is to just not buy things in the first place. But that's, of course, not always possible. But trying to get away with buying less is a really good first start. And one of the ways in which you can get away with doing that is by looking after what you have already. Simple things like repairing our clothes. I don't mean sort of, you have to be an amazing, get a sewing machine and start creating your own things like that. I just mean simple things like sewing on a button. So when you get, you might get an item and it comes with a spare button, keep it. Get a little special box and keep it. Learn how to sew on a button. There are countless YouTube videos on it. And little things like, you can get special little, I can't remember what they're called now, but you can buzz them over your clothes and it gets rid of it. It's like a lint remover. So when you get a jumper and it goes a bit bobbly and you think, oh, this is looking past its best. You can do things like that and make it go for another couple of years. Another thing that's a brilliant option is buying secondhand. Because if we're thinking back to that idea of something new appearing in the world, like a new garment, well, the secondhand already exists. And this is just getting bigger and bigger, especially with the rise of online platforms. We're seeing eBay, of course, but now with Vinted, I think it's becoming more and more common for people to buy secondhand. Having a good reach around in your local charity shop. I was really chuffed because last week I found an amazing wool coat in my local charity shop. So I got this beautiful winter coat. It was £10 and didn't have to buy a brand new coat. So things like that. There's also things, if you want to give, if you are going to buy something new, of course, this can be tricky because one thing probably should mention really is this idea of financial exclusion and ethical, sustainable fashion, because it often does come with a higher price point. But if you are going to buy new things, do try and look for sustainable, ethical brands. If you're going to buy cotton, try and get GOT certified organic cotton. Try and look for that fair trade logo. That could be very, very helpful. And if you want to try and sort of change your perception of how many clothes you need, take part in a fashion challenge. Lots of fashion challenges now go across the year, and I've done a couple myself. So there's things like Labour Behind the Label 6-item challenge, where you have 6 things that you wear over 6 weeks. And there's a tier fund challenge as well, and it's sort of 10 items over a month. And the idea of them is to raise awareness, but also it's great because you suddenly go, I really don't need as much stuff as I thought I did, because most of your wardrobes are redundant for that time, and you go, oh yeah, I really don't need that much. No one noticed. It was easier because I just got ready really quickly in the morning. So that's quite a fun option. And then the other thing probably is, of course, that you can do is being really careful with how you wash things. So that, people talk about that classic, turning down from 40 to 30. You don't even have to wash things on a 30-degree cycle. You can wash things on a 0-degree cycle. The soap will still do the job of cleaning your clothes. If you've got delicate things or anything, just try it on 0, see how it goes, or 20 if you can, if your machine lets you. Trying to avoid the tumble dryer, or You can get heat pump tumble dryers now that are a bit more efficient, but just popping things out, that kind of thing as well. And then finally, when it does get to that time when you've repaired that jumper as much as you can, you've filled in all the holes and it really is falling apart, or you really just don't want it anymore. Just whatever you try and do, please just don't put it in the bin. Sell your clothes, make some money, donate them to a charity shop, reuse it if you can, repurpose it. So you could use it for just simple things like cleaning around the house or dust sheets, that thing. Just try and throw away as little as possible, is probably a good tip.
Those are such great tips, and I think students should feel, I said, like we were talking about it earlier, that consumers do have a lot of power in this kind of space. And if students want to do something at school, or if anyone wants to do something with their friends, setting up a clothes swap is like a really easy thing to do. I know students in my school, they did it last term and had over 500 items of clothing come in that was swapped, which was incredible.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
And
Well, one person's waste is another person's treasure.
yeah,
And that just goes to prove it. If you had 500 items that found a new home that were unwanted.
yeah, it was just a little bit of organising, didn't take that long, and just everybody came out. And I think the buzz of people, because obviously you're not paying for anything to get something new, and even if it was quite small, you could just pick up anything. So it worked really, really well. And I think those trends, as you were saying, I spoke to my friend in the holidays and she was like, oh, I'm doing shop my wardrobe. I was like, what's shop your wardrobe? And I think it's just the idea that you see your wardrobe as a new shop, and therefore you try not to buy anything. So kind of, yeah, maybe even if it's a tag or way of a kind of fashion challenge, it's just all very important to get us thinking about consumption and some really good techniques that you've just recommended.
Yeah, and I like some of those techniques because fashion, it's nice to be enjoyed. Like people often love fashion, and they love clothes, and it says a lot about our identity and who we are. It's just being mindful about it and just being a bit careful, being aware of those issues which I outlined, and trying to be quite careful around them and try and find different solutions to them.
Yeah, and people can be even more creative, as you're saying, by wearing something in a slightly different way. Then you can still, I've said, fashion is so much so important for expression for so many people, and you can still achieve that through maybe mixing up how you're wearing something, or wear it slightly differently, or putting it away and pulling it out in the summer or something like that. So you can still, as you said, have that joy, but just that awareness as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice approach, joyful but aware.
And then I ask all of our guests at the end, and I think you have some really good, hopefully tips come up on your journey into university geography. So how did you get to where you are? And then do you have any advice? And I know that you mentioned to me earlier that you actually went on a summer program that kind of is still going now, that introduced students to geography at university, and that was really fundamental in your own journey. So would you mind telling us a bit about your journey, and then any advice?
Of course. So I did geography at A level, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I think because geography is such a fantastic subject, because I was always a bit of a jack of all trades and I like to learn about everything. So I knew I wanted to do geography, particularly I was interested very much in human geography. And my school advertised to me about a summer school placement with the Sutton Trust. And the Sutton Trust, what they do is they try and promote people who are first in their family, as in the first in their family to go to university, to get to university. And they were running a summer school. And at the time, they were running them in just a few universities, but now they run them across a lot of universities across the country, not just in geography, but in lots of disciplines. But I went to one in the School of Geography at the University of Nottingham. And I did that when I was in year 12, and I went there for a week, and I was taught by the lecturers, and we went on mini field trips, and it just helped me get a feel for the place. And it's hard when you're applying for university, you're committing to so much and you really know so little, and it was just nice being able to get that feel for the school and the campus. And so I decided that was definitely what I wanted to do, and I put it down as my choice of where I wanted to go. And then I got in. So that was great. And the lovely thing about the Sutton Trust was it helped me pay for those. I'm not sure what the situation now is with the Sutton Trust, but at the time it paid for my tuition fees, which were lower back then, unfortunately. I don't know what the situation is now. So that just really helped me encourage to get to university. And then I was at Nottingham for 3 years, and I studied a lot about the geographies of fashion, and I fell in love with it. And it was my dissertation supervisor who said to me, Amber, I think you should pursue this maybe as a career. So that's when I went on to do my master's and PhD in geography.
That's absolutely brilliant. And so did university open you up to the geographies of fashion, or were you just interested in human geography before?
I had no idea, I think, because at the time when I was studying geography, I know that in A-level GCSE geography, everyone's introduced a lot more now to fashion and globalization. It's not, whereas when I did it, that wasn't part of the curriculum. So it was completely opened my eyes when I went there, and I was suddenly like, yes, this is what I'm really interested in, and consumption and sustainability. So that's what I then wanted to go on to do.
Brilliant. And as Anna said, the Sutton Trust is still, I think, still works for students in the summer as well. So if you are thinking about geography at university, definitely Google it, have a look up, or maybe speak to someone at school as well, because it's a fantastic opportunity for you to do in that Year 12 summer to understand what it's like to study at university.
Yeah, it's true. And also even at Coventry, we run lots of things for local, not just sixth formers, but even younger students as well, and do special visits where students come in, or we go out and do talks as well, because we really try and promote sort of local students, who want to come to university, and get them to come and study with us, which we really love.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I think everybody can kind of probably reflect on their own engagement with fashion, and those practical steps you gave were absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for taking the time, and a massive thank you from the Time for Geography community, Curious Geographer, and it's been an absolute pleasure to have you as a guest.
Oh no, the pleasure's all mine. Thank you for having me.
I'll just let everybody know that we do have a live interview coming up in the after half term, and then if you haven't already check out the smaller videos, the highlight reel kind of focus parts that you can watch in Time for Geography, which are shorter clips, about 6 minutes to 5 to 6 minutes, which are on the Time for Geography channel, which you can use to get a little highlight of something we talked about in the live interview. So that's everything from me, and I hope everybody has a lovely rest of their week.